Hello and welcome to Hop Along Studio. So today I wanted to share with you a technique that I use on the scrapbooking page, but we're going to move it onto an art panel. The reason I chose this particular layout is I recently got it published in the Creative Scrapbooker magazine. And here is my layout in the magazine, and I was really proud to actually be included in the magazine this month. So I really love the scrapbooking layout, but sometimes you may want to move it to something that isn't a scrapbooking page. So I'll show you how to use these techniques with other images to move to an art panel. So let's get started. So let's first talk about the board that we'll be using in this project. So this is a canvas board. It's 8 inches by 8 inches. This one's an Art Advantage canvas board. It has been pre-primed, so it's pretty much ready to go. And so for this particular art panel, I'm using this as my main image. It's a door. I have this set of Minte papers. This is actually a Polish company, and they have these doors, and they're of all these different designs of doors. And I saw this and I thought, well, that's something I can definitely be able to use in my art journals and in my creative projects. So I purchased it, and again, these doors come in a lot of different shapes and sizes. So again, you can use a really small door. I wanted something that filled about a third to half the panel. I wanted it to be a strong focal image, and I don't usually go super light with my projects. I usually go quite bold and colorful, so I wanted to use a white door and try to go for a little bit of a lighter color scheme than what I usually use. So the first step is to add some texture and pattern to this canvas board. In this case, I'm using the Stampers Anonymous Tim Holtz Baroque collection. I love these flourishes and just the beautiful patterns that they have. When I did this as a scrapbooking page, I actually just used ink, but in this case, I want something that's going to be able to handle light a lot better, and ink will fade over time. So in this case, I'm actually using some of this Paper Artsy Calypso paint. I'm just adding it onto my jelly plate. And if you haven't seen me do this before, I've done this in other videos where I'm basically using my jelly plate as a stamp pad. This is a much easier way to get your paint onto your stamping surface without it really gumming up your stamps. And so you can see I'm getting some good coverage there. And I think I'm actually going to take this off because, as you can see, I'm actually having a hard time getting those center spots. And so if you ever have issues with that, just take your stamp off your stamp pad, and there you go. You can see you can get a much cleaner image. I actually went over this in a video that I did specifically about stamping, which is in the card above. If it's something that you'd be interested in learning, just to how to get a better image. And in this case, it's okay that we're not getting a perfect image. It's more about making sure that we want to get enough of it so it doesn't look like we're just constantly having stamping errors. And so at this point, I'm just basically covering the entire board with some level of pattern. I'm doing this quickly. A lot of this is eventually going to be covered up. And to be honest, I don't usually stamp on canvas like this, so this is a bit of an experiment for me. So I'm seeing that there's some things to be learned from this. It's good to actually have a nice stamp, but you're going to have to kind of work it into some of these spots. It's not going to stamp consistently, and again, just the canvas itself has a little bit of texture so that you basically end up with something that may not stamp as perfectly as you'd like. And so in this case, just to clean up my jelly plate, I'm just taking a piece of copy paper and taking a print. It's probably not going to be a really pretty print, but as you can see, that kind of just takes up some of the paint and allows me to clean this up really quickly. So in this case, I don't think I'm totally done. I love the blue, but I do want to add a little bit of yellow to this as well. And not in as many places, but I will add it. So in this case, I'm actually using the other Baroque stamp. And the nice thing is when you take this off the stamp pad and you don't always ink it perfectly, the neat thing is then you start getting different textures. And you also can do 2 or 3 stamps, which I've also talked about in another video as well, about the idea of you can use not just the first value, but there's other values that you can use to get a different feel to this. So there you go. You can see that you're getting some of the yellow, some of the blue. I'm going to take another print, clean up this jelly plate, and then I'm actually going to run over to my sink and clean up both the stamps and the jelly plate. You do not want to let this sit because it will ruin both your jelly plate and your stamps. So this should be fully dry by the time you get back from cleaning your stamps. And I'm going to start by adding my door image and deciding kind of where I want my focal image to be. I wanted an image that was taking up a good percentage of the space on my panel. And I love this brickwork stencil. I've had the stencil for probably 15 years, so I can't even tell you where I got it anymore. So instead of just adding paint through here, instead I want a little bit of dimension. So I'm going to add some fiber paste. A fiber paste is actually fairly easy to work with. If you do not have fiber paste, and maybe try modeling paste. That's a good option as well for this. But the fiber paste I know will be easy to add ink and other mediums on top and still look really, really good. It absorbs really well. So as you can see, it actually is very smooth and easy to apply. And then just basically just press it through. Go in both directions just so that you end up getting full coverage. And use a smaller palette knife. I know there's long ones like this. I prefer these really short ones. They're a little bit easier to control. And there's a reason this one has so many layers of paint on it, is because I've used it a lot. I've used it in really large palette paintings. I've used it for small projects like this. It's been probably one of my go-to knives, so it's the one I default to. And you kind of want to have a variation along this edge here. So try to not have it all be the same distance out. There you go. There's not a huge amount of space between the bricks, but you will notice as we go along with this, you'll be able to see the spaces in between there as we kind of add other things on top. And this is a little hard to do. I'm going to not have a perfect image here, but I did want to try to carry this a little bit further down. Yes, it makes a little bit of a mess of the ones above, but it's not really a problem. And again, this guy's going to be probably sitting around there, so that's fine. I'm going to continue to add my fiber paste until I get it all down. And then just run your palette knife along the edge there so you don't end up having a really messy edge that dries that way. So in this case, I'm going to very gently try to add in the brick pattern along the bottom. And the idea is you're trying not to lose all of your detail on your other bits, and sometimes it means you just run your knife around it a little bit and just soften it a little bit so it doesn't look like as much of a mistake, that it's kind of meant to be a little bit textural. And I don't necessarily care to have the paste be all the way around the door. I just wanted to give it an area that it kind of fell onto the background. So we're going to set this aside and let it dry fully before we move on to the next step. So once you've got this fully dry, the next thing you want to do is start adding some extra layers to the background. So I'm going to be using some Liquitex gesso to be able to add a little bit more white to this background. So what I'm doing is adding this chicken wire stencil in a couple places. So I'm just basically grabbing a little bit of the white paint and very gently putting it through the stencil. You do not want to cover up the entire design below. The point isn't for perfect coverage. The idea is to soften it a little bit. As you can see, that makes this a little bit softer and it blends it in a little bit better. And you don't want to do it on the entire surface, just in some areas here and there. It's very subtle, but again, it adds a little bit more variation to your background. I also want to add a little bit of gray paint to the bricks that I have put down. So I've basically grabbed a little bit of hickory smoke paint, mixed it with a little bit of water from my paintbrush to make this really kind of soft gray wash. And I'm just adding it in places. And this is where the fiber paste is great because it does soak up some of that color. By making a very soft wash. And after I've done a little bit of that soft wash, you can either add a little bit of water in with a spray bottle, or you can just use a little bit of extra water from your paintbrush to get that effect. Just basically want to make sure that doesn't fall completely to the background. You want some places that are a little bit more intense and other ones that are a little bit lighter to kind of get that effect you're looking for. Spritz a little bit of water just to soften it up a little bit. You kind of want it to fall in the crevices as well as staying on the top. And maybe pull it past where you can onto your board, just so that it doesn't look like we have a block of color here and then nothing else. You want things to kind of blend and kind of move, but you don't necessarily want it to all look one way. And before we add in a bunch of other ephemera on top, the next thing I'm going to do is try some of this wax old denim from All Art Alchemy and add a little bit onto the bricks as well. I haven't actually used this a lot, so we will see how this goes. I haven't actually tried this before, so hopefully this works okay. I actually kind of like the smell of this stuff. It's this kind of shimmery wax. It kind of adds like a little bit of something. Just a little of texture, a little bit of color. It's nice for those kind of raised spots. It's maybe a little shiny to be using for bricks, but I don't know. It's not. It doesn't have to always be perfectly photorealistic for some of these things. I do like the little bit of shimmer that it adds. I actually don't know. Let's try adding a little bit of water to it. Let's see what happens there. It blends a little bit with water, not a ton. Oh, there we go. Yeah. So I'm learning as I'm filming as we go. Basically, yeah, by adding a little bit of water, again, you can soften that up again a little bit more, have the color go a little bit further. Kind of depends on what kind of look you're looking for. I bought this stuff a couple years ago and haven't really played with it. I just saw it in my stash, and when I was going to film this video, I'm like, oh, why not just throw it on the panel, see what happens. And there's some green of the same wax, so let's give this a little bit of this on here and see what happens. Kind of fun. Actually, that green kind of reminds me of the idea of mossy bricks. my climate, we don't usually end up with very mossy bricks because we're not that humid. We're quite dry. But when I've been traveling and I've seen places like that have those kind of mossy bricks that have had vines growing on them for years, this is what this reminds me of. Yeah, so I think that's kind of fun. And then you add in your doorway. I feel like that kind of adds a lot of variety and texture to this background. So the next step of this project is to add a lot of our ephemera and embellishments. So I want to be able to put this on last. And the reason for that being is we're going to take all of these random pieces and make them a little bit more cohesive by adding paint and other things on top. So you want to make sure that you leave room for your focal image, but you don't want it glued on the page while you're doing this step. And so I'm just using this high-tack gem glue. It's meant for bonding to non-paper surfaces. And so I'm hoping that this will help me get a lot of these embellishments on without too much trouble. And I'm trying to think about groupings when I'm doing this. Think a little bit about where you want your page and how you want things to fall, and put some of your pieces on accordingly. And choose a glue that will dry clear. It will make a big difference on how the final look of this is. So this is taking a little bit longer than I expected. So I'm moving actually to some gloss super heavy gel. I'm going to try to continue on with this. This actually might be a bit faster. It might show up a little bit glossy, but by the time we add some paint and other things on top, it shouldn't be totally noticeable. Only thing with this is I'm going to have to go in with a baby wipe and clean up some edges. And it's okay if it's actually a little bit sticking out. These buildings are a little bit harder than some of the other things, but I think this will stick a little bit better and I'll have a little bit better adhesion and be a little bit quicker than what I've been doing with the glue bottle. That particular bottle is an older glue that I have, so I wonder if some of it's just stiffened up over time, because I don't remember it being that hard to do before. So we always keep learning as we do these projects. What's good about this too is when you have things like this that are really hard to actually get them to stick to the page, you can basically fill it with the medium. So now it's a nice flat surface that will actually stick to the page. This work is a little bit sticky, so don't be surprised if you start sticking to your project. And this is where the challenge can come in when you're using both a heavier medium underneath, because it does affect how some of this stuff will stick. And this is where I've kind of deviated from my scrapbooking layout where I had everything fairly flat, so it was very easy to have things stick to. Now I've tried something a little different just for more interest, but with it sometimes comes some of the compromises that you need to make these things work. You know what? I'm going to add these other pieces on top. I'm just having them not be glued all the way to the edge, just so that they end up hanging out on top and won't touch my image underneath. You don't want to glue this down until last, and so because of that you have to be kind of clever about how you put your pieces so that it all works well. And if anyone has an idea of what the best adhesive is for doing projects like this, please let me know in the comments. I would love to get your take on this. Again, this is not something I do very often. I just wanted to show you kind of a concept, an idea that you could use in your own work. Once this is fully dry, the next thing you want to do is try to find a way to make the layout a little bit more cohesive. Right now we have all these different colors and textures, and so to help this become a bit more cohesive, we're going to add some white paint. And you can either use gesso or paint. I'm just using a little bit of gesso here. I'm using a little bit of water because I don't want to necessarily be completely opaque. You may want to let a little bit of things come through, but you just want to basically just add a little bit of the paint onto the surface. This is going to make everything become a lot more cohesive. And depending on how contrasting these are, you may want to actually leave some of the color in there. You may want to cover up all of the color. Like for these green flowers, I'm going to definitely cover up all the color. But for some of the metal pieces, because I don't mind having a little bit of the metal look to these items. I'm not necessarily going to go as crazy covering up all of the color. And with this one here, I want to actually let that remember shine through. So to do that, I'm actually just adding a little bit of the paint to the edges. In this case, I am going to actually wipe some of it off. I want it muted, but I don't want to lose the remember. And just continue to do that to all your pieces until you have the coverage that you want. So there you can see that by adding the white paint, that just kind of brings everything together. If you're having trouble getting into some of the crevices, that's where you could go with a little bit more water with your gesso on your paintbrush, and that'll help you get into those little crevices. You just may have to do a layer or two. You might notice that there's still a little bit of those soft kind of pinks and oranges and everything from the actual color of the embellishments kind of coming through a little bit. You can either add extra layers of paint, or you can leave it as we're going to continue to add color on top. So you want to let this fully dry, and then we'll move on to the next step. So now that our paint has dried, we will start adding some more color to it. One thing I did not mention is that you also, if you wanted to add any embellishments on top of your image, you're going to need to put white paint on them and then just spray them or color them individually before you add them to the page. I'm going to start by deciding what I want to do to add some color to these images. I have a variety of options. I have some oxide sprays, some mica spray. I have a lot of ink-based materials. I also have high flow paint. It kind of depends on where you want to go with this. You can keep everything very light. You can keep things a little bit more opaque, depending on what look you're looking for. One thing I'm going to bring into consideration is because this is an art panel, it's going to see a lot more light. So you either need to use some sort of UV spray or workable fixative, or stick mostly to acrylics to be able to keep this light fast. But if you're using this on a scrapbooking page or in a book, ink sprays are great because they're easy to apply, they dry quickly, and again, your book or your scrapbooking page isn't going to see light all the time. So things to consider before choosing what sprays you're going to use on your project. So I'm going to use a little bit of these distress oxide sprays at first, just to see kind of what I can get. And that's pretty bright. So I'm going to go in with a little bit of water just to soften that up. That sprayed a little bit more than what I thought it was going to. And this is where, in areas like this, where maybe you don't want to lose your remember, you can dab off in places. And you can move the paint around a little bit. But what's nice about this is it actually kind of brings it to the edges. And again, one thing you can do is when you know you have sprays like this that like to run a lot, the other thing you can do is just let it go down the page. Let it get into those cracks of the bricks and find its way through. And again, it just softens everything. It softens things into the background, but you still see those background patterns. These ones have a little bit more of a spray radius than what I had originally pictured, and that's totally fine. So I'm also going to go in with a little bit of the squeezed lemonade as well. And again, you can leave it as is, or you can move paint around like I am. Or ink, sorry, ink around like I am. And this is where if you want a little bit more control than less, you can also choose just to add either a little bit of water or use your paintbrush and allow color to kind of float the way you would like it to float. So you can see here I have a little bit darker, and up in the corner a little bit lighter. So I'm going to continue to add a few layers. This might be a little too bold, but I'm going to use a little bit of this dark blue spray paint. But I'm spraying it in very small spaces. Because again, this one's pretty intense. But this is again where you can allow the stuff to seep and move as you see fit, and they can add some fun color and variation to your piece. And some of my inks have a lot of mica in them, so sometimes they end up kind of not working according to plan, but that's also where you can just pull the thing out of the spray bottle and just add a little bit of color, and then just use your water to make it mix. It's not what I call ideal. You could also use a pipette for this. But I like these particular ones because they have a little bit of mica in them. So varying between the light and the opaque, you can get some very interesting color variations. This is another very bright color. I feel like I want more color on the clock, but I don't want to lose all the color in behind, so I'm going to have to try to be clever about this. That's pretty dark, so I want to follow through with maybe a little bit of this distress spray. I'm also going to use a tiny bit of high flow paint in here. It's a great way of adding some really high pigment to it. The golden fluid acrylics are amazing. I use them a lot in my fluid painting. I actually like doing a lot of pouring medium. And they're pretty much the only thing to use if you really want really great results in your pouring medium. But they also work really well in these types of applications. And I also have some teal. So I'm going to add a little bit of that to my umbrella. And this is where, by using a combination of painting and other things, you can add a little bit of variation. You can keep this extremely random, or you can paint and be a little bit more specific in your layout. What's good you added gesso to start with is it's a great way of adding tooth to this so that the paint and the ink stick to it instead of just coming off of it. Gone a little bit more purple there than I want, so I'm just going to add a little bit more of that distress spray. And because these guys are going to be along the bottom, I'm going to do them in a little bit more of the yellows and the greens. I'm actually going to do them on my palette sheet just so that I have a little less of a mess. So I'm going to set this aside to dry, and then I'm going to add a little bit more color on top. So once you've let this dry, you can kind of put your door in, or your whatever your focal image is in, for kind of a test fit. And I noticed that I went way more colorful than I originally planned for this, but that's okay. What I'm going to do is add, again, a few more top layers to this, maybe to soften it up a bit and maybe try to tie it back into the wet a little bit more. So I'm just going to go in and I'm going to add a couple different things. One, you can just use a little bit of white paint on your finger. I'm actually just going to add a little bit of water to it. And this is where, if you feel like you've gone a little dark, add in a little bit of that white. Always pull it back. With these layers, the nice thing about it is really nothing set in stone. You can just keep adding layers and layers until you find the right balance for yourself. And it's pretty much just add your highlights back in a little bit. Very easy to take this too far, and I think I may have taken this a step or two too far. But again, by just rubbing a little bit of white on the tops of the surfaces, that can also help you bring out some of these details, like the details of the clock, some edges. The comment I've always had made when I've been doing in my acrylic painting classes is always have the lightest and darkest colors next to each other for creating contrast. So you can have lots of colors in there, but then you just add in that little bit of contrast at the end and just helps things pop a little bit. You can now add in a little bit of these waxes as well. Maybe what it is, you want to add them to the background in places to just maybe deepen in places. You can also add them on top of some of your items. The other option too is you put in these dark spots and you put them as a contrast to some of the highlights that you've just added. Just get that added dimension. You just add along the edges a little bit. And this is quite a glittery wax, so it does add some fun. And even by adding it and just in the small spots and next to those brighter colors can add really kind of a fun look to these. Going with the green in a couple little places. You have all these fun dimensional pieces, so it's trying to make sure that you have them kind of stick out the way you hope they will. So as this is dry, the next thing you want to do is add in your focal image. In this case, I'm going to slide it in behind here, but because it's actually going to sit on top of those, I'm actually going to want to pop it up in some areas just to make sure that it sits properly. And to do that, I'm just going to add these dimensional adhesive dots. And you can kind of put it in place, make sure that those are actually sitting where you want them to sit. And that actually works pretty well. Put a few more along this edge. And we'll see how well these secure. This is not usually what I use for this type of stuff, but at the same time, this is quite a bit more dimensional. So I don't necessarily want to be using a gel. It might get a little bit messy, and I don't want to try to keep this as clean looking as possible. It seems to be sticking really quite well. So perfect. That is exactly what I was hoping for this project. Let's make sure I have that nice and straight. And then what you can do is now add in those final embellishments. So in this case, I'm going to add in my key. I'm actually going to slide that one in behind. I was originally going to put it on top, but I actually like it slid in behind a little bit more. And to add those items, I'm going to go back to using my super heavy gel very carefully with a palette knife. And because this little balloon has managed to knock itself loose just through adding all of the mediums, I'm also going to add a little bit there. And it will dry clear, so it's okay if there's a little bit of gel peeking on through. You will not notice it once it's dry. So here's our final project. So moving away from a scrapbooking page and moving into an art canvas is just a little bit different. I use the door instead of using a picture, but a lot of the techniques is still the same. I did add the medium, which does add a little bit of complexity just because it takes a little bit more work to find the right glue that's going to attach to this layout. Again, I tried a couple different glues in this, but I definitely prefer the heavy gel medium. It always gives a really good adhesion, and because it is archival, it's great for using on panels like this. I have to say that this panel is a bit darker in color than I planned on. I tend to move towards colorful when I was trying to stick it to a little bit more white, but I did manage to keep a little bit of the lighter color in there, so I'm pretty happy with the overall result. So if you've enjoyed this project, I'd appreciate if you subscribe to my channel. I really appreciate the support, and every week I'm bringing you new videos on creative techniques. I also have my website, hopalongstudio.com, where I have written instructions for each of my projects, as well as other ideas on how you can have creative self-care in your own life. I hope you have a really great week, and I will see you next time.